Why was Rome more lenient toward homosexuality than medieval Europe? In ancient Rome, two men flirting in a bathhouse might earn a joke and a wink. In medieval Europe, the same scene could end in a courtroom. Same desire, two worlds, completely different rules. Walk the streets with me. Rome treats it like background noise in graffiti and dinner talk. What matters is who does what and where. Centuries later, the mood hardens, sermons bite, laws sharpen, and whispers turn into charges. The line moves from laughter to fear, from private teasing to public punishment. I won't name the cause here. We'll trace it in the clues law, language, shame, status, and let the pattern show itself. Tell me the exact time you're watching dawn scroll or midnight dive. If this pulled you in, tap like so the next chapter reaches a little farther. You stand at the edge of the Roman Forum, where marble columns catch the late sun like frozen lightning. The air smells of olive oil and ambition. Here, the word tolerance doesn't mean what you think it does. The Romans weren't waving rainbow flags or preaching equality. Their leniency towards same-sex relations came from something colder, older, and more practical power. In Rome, desire was allowed only if it obeyed hierarchy. Imagine the city like a grand theater of dominance. Every citizen knew his role. Senators in white togas, slaves in chains, soldiers in armor polished by desert wind, all of them locked in invisible ranks. To the Roman mind, intimacy wasn't about love or identity. It was about who stood above whom. A man could share his bed with another man. Sure, but he had to remain the conqueror, never the conquered. That was the rule. The concept of sexual orientation didn't even exist. The Romans had no words for straight or gay. They had words for active and passive, for master and subject. To be the one in control was virtuous. To yield was shameful, especially if you were a freeborn citizen. In this strange equation, masculinity wasn't tied to whom you desired, it was tied to how you behaved while desiring. Think of it like prison rules, a modern echo that's disturbingly accurate. In confined spaces ruled by men, ancient legions, naval galleys, or modern penitentiaries, hierarchies often redefine intimacy. Dominance becomes currency, submission, punishment. It's not affection that decides the act's meaning, but power. That was Rome in a nutshell. Take the emperor, Julius Caesar. His enemies mocked him endlessly for his alleged affair with King Nicomedes of Bithynia. They didn't care that he had relations with a man, they cared that he might have played the lower role. The insult stuck to him for decades. Repeated by senators in whispers and jokes carved into tavern walls. Even victorious generals weren't immune to gossip if they were suspected of losing face between the sheets. Meanwhile, the poets had a field day. Catullus wrote of young men with tender limbs and bright eyes. Martial joked about senators sneaking into dark alleys. Juvenal roasted hypocrites who sermonized about morality by day and sought pleasure by night. Rome wasn't hiding these stories. It was publishing them on papyrus and laughing about it over wine. That's the strange paradox. Rome was lenient, but not compassionate. Same-sex acts were accepted as long as they reinforced the pecking order. You could desire anyone, as long as your social standing stayed intact. If you were rich, male, and free, you could practically do as you pleased. But heaven help the man of lower status who crossed the invisible line upward, and there were other practical reasons for this leniency. The empire was obsessed with lineage. Marriages existed for heirs, not passion. Women were often secluded, married off young, treated like extensions of family property. Real companionship, conversation, friendship, politics happened among men. It was inevitable that affection sometimes deepened into something more. You can almost hear the logic in a Roman senator's voice. Why risk scandal or unwanted pregnancy with another man's daughter when you can spend your nights with your own slave, or squire crude as it sounds? That mindset shaped an empire's bedroom politics. Homosexual relations weren't a threat to social order. They were part of it. The Romans didn't think in moral absolutes. Their gods were as flawed as they were. Jupiter, chief of the heavens, famously kidnapped the Trojan boy Ganymede to serve as his divine cupbearer. Even the cosmos seemed to wink at the idea that male beauty was a prize worth stealing. When your gods behave that way, it's hard to preach abstinence. Still, this was a society built on appearance and honor. Reputation was everything. A Roman man could indulge, but he couldn't look weak. Every gesture, every rumor mattered. What happened in private stayed private. But once it reached the Senate floor or the gossip of the baths, your legacy trembled. And maybe that's what makes this story so human. For all their grandeur and conquest, the Romans were terrified of humiliation. Even in love, or something like it, they measured worth by power. And power, in Rome, was sacred. The marble under your feet feels warm, as if it remembers every whispered scandal, every midnight tryst buried beneath layers of empire. The city hums with ghosts that never learned shame the way later centuries would teach it. You sense the coming shift, though the shadow of a new faith rising beyond the horizon, ready to rewrite what it means to sin. You follow the hum of the city toward a courtyard where soldiers are drilling, sandals clapping against stone in perfect rhythm. Here, in the Republic's early days, discipline was the purest virtue, and even pleasure had to march in step. Roman sexuality was a military operation, run by rules of rank. The simplest way to describe it, whoever commanded, commanded everything. It might sound odd to modern ears, but Romans thought of intimacy as an extension of victory. To conquer a city or a man were gestures of the same spirit. You might find that barbaric, but for them, it was as natural as breathing. The line between battlefield and bedroom was thin. Both were arenas to prove dominance. The act itself wasn't judged immoral, only the role within it was. If this sounds familiar, it should. Walk through the logic of a prison block, and you'll see the ghost of Rome there. The hierarchy of who owns power and who loses it hasn't changed much in human psychology. Rome just made it law. For free men, the shame wasn't in desire but in submission. To be on the receiving end meant surrendering your dignity, your citizenship, your masculinity. To be penetrated by someone of lower status was like being conquered by an inferior army. It shattered the hierarchy. That's why most Roman men had no issue sleeping with male slaves or prostitutes. It wasn't about gender, it was about control. A patrician could indulge his whims as long as he stayed the dominant figure. The moment he allowed a reversal of roles, he was mocked as synodus, a word so layered with contempt that it meant more than effeminate. It meant defeated. Picture this: two young legionaries resting by a campfire after a long march. One boasts of his conquests, both military and personal, while the other teases him about rumors in the barracks. The banter sounds rough, But behind the humor lies a real social threat. To accuse a soldier of playing the woman was to strip away his honor. It was an insult that could haunt him from the battlefield to his tombstone. And yet, these same men shared tents, baths, rations, and sometimes deep affection. It wasn't unusual for lifelong bonds to form between comrades, bonds strong enough to make them fight harder, even die for each other. Roman historians recorded stories of such loyalty, though they rarely admitted what those bonds truly were. Still, you can read between the lines, affection existed. It just wasn't allowed to be equal. Even Roman law reflected this power dynamic. The Lex Scantinia, one of the few statutes addressing male-male relations, punished citizens who dishonored others of equal or higher class through sexual acts. It wasn't a moral law, it was a protection of status. The state didn't care what happened in brothels or bathhouses, it cared about the dignity of its free-born men. The same mindset extended to the household. Roman fathers held near absolute power over their families, patria potestas. They could decide who married, who lived under their roof, even who lived at all. So, if the head of the house took a liking to a servant boy, it wasn't considered scandalous, merely private. The servant, lacking status, had no say. What we might call abuse today, they saw as order. When you think about it, Rome's sexual system wasn't about pleasure, it was about hierarchy management. It kept social lines clean, reputation secure, and heirs legitimate. Women's bodies were for reproduction, men's bodies for recreation, slaves' bodies for service. Everyone had a place, and that place defined what was proper. One Roman satirist joked that even the gods must have kept ledgers of who played which role. Otherwise, Olympus would descend into chaos. And maybe he wasn't entirely joking. In a city obsessed with control, even lust had paperwork. Do you ever wonder how exhausting that must have been? To constantly measure every gesture, every rumor, every glance through the lens of rank. The average Roman lived inside an invisible social cage, bars, built not of iron, but of expectations. You could enjoy freedom only as long as others believed you ruled it. Still, there was a strange kind of stability in this system. Everyone knew the rules, however twisted they were. The empire could absorb Greek art, Egyptian gods, and Persian spices, but it always kept the same logic of dominance intact. The forum might overflow with debates about honor and virtue, but no one questioned why those virtues depended on making someone else smaller. As the drills end, the soldiers file out toward the bathhouse, laughing, their armor clinking like applause. Beneath the noise, you catch a whiff of the next layer of Roman logic, a quiet belief that intimacy without risk of pregnancy was, in a way, practical. No dowries, no scandals, no heirs to argue over. Just another form of control disguised as convenience. The smell of wet marble and olive soap drifts through the air as you step into a Roman bathhouse. Steam coils like ghosts, wrapping around the bodies of men lounging, arguing, and laughing as if the Republic itself were suspended in vapor. This is where the city's pulse slows, where senators, soldiers, and slaves might all share the same pool, though never the same status. And it's here you begin to see how pleasure became practical. Rome was obsessed with order, lineage, and reputation, but it also understood appetite. The empire's men found in each other a safer playground for desire, one without the messy complications of childbirth or scandal. In a world where women were largely confined to homes, courtyards, and childbirth, intimacy between men seemed almost efficient. You could call it the Roman version of no strings attached. For elite men, relations with male partners, especially slaves or freedmen, carried fewer risks than affairs with married women, which could destroy families and provoke duels. A lover of lower rank couldn't file complaints or demand inheritance. It was pleasure without paperwork. The moral logic was astonishingly simple. Women were for duty. Men were for enjoyment. A married man was expected to fulfill his civic obligation, produce heirs, maintain alliances, and then quietly pursue whatever other interests soothed his restless energy. That might sound outrageous now, but to Romans, it was common sense. After all, pregnancy could wreck reputations and bloodlines. Two men together, no offspring, no gossip, no scandal, just a satisfied ego and a stable household. Of course, this wasn't compassion disguised as culture. It was power disguised as practicality. Men of lower status didn't enjoy the same freedoms if a slave or a freedman showed interest beyond what his master wanted. It could end violently. Consent, as we understand it today, barely entered the conversation. But among elites, the practice flourished, and Rome hardly blinked. There's something strangely familiar about that reasoning, isn't there? Even in modern workplaces or politics, people still disguise selfish behavior as efficiency. Power finds excuses that sound rational. Rome simply perfected the art 2,000 years early. You might picture Emperor Hadrian and his beloved Antinous, the most famous same-sex pair in Roman history. Antinous was a Greek youth of striking beauty, known for his quiet demeanor and loyalty. When he mysteriously drowned in the Nile, Hadrian was inconsolable. He deified the boy, founded cities in his name, and filled the empire with statues of him idealized, eternal, radiant. To Romans, this wasn't strange. It was tragedy draped in marble. Love and worship had fused into one. Hadrian's grief tells you everything about Roman priorities. It wasn't the relationship that shocked people. It was the public display of vulnerability. Emotion was considered unmanly, but affection, if properly aestheticized, was forgivable. The emperor could weep, but only in marble. And yet, underneath that elegance lurked something darker. The normalization of power-based intimacy reinforced inequality. A man's body could be adored or used depending on his class. A boy's youth might be idolized. But his adulthood, once his beauty faded, would be discarded like a worn-out amphora. Even love had an expiration date written by hierarchy. Still, compared to what came later, this was paradise. Romans didn't criminalize acts between men. They merely sorted them by status. Sex was a social performance, not a moral battlefield. The gods didn't mind. Jupiter himself chased mortals of every kind. Apollo fell for shepherd boys, even Hercules. The muscle-bound hero had male lovers recorded in verse. How could something divine be wicked if Olympus did it too? Here's the irony. Rome's leniency wasn't born of tolerance, it was born of indifference. Pleasure was just another appetite to be managed. Like wine or gambling, as long as you kept your dignity, you could indulge. It's why the same senators who thundered about discipline and virtue could later be found in private gardens whispering verses to their favorite companions. You might smile at the hypocrisy, but it's hard not to see the system's efficiency. By separating pleasure from reproduction, the Romans stumbled upon a pragmatic loophole: enjoy desire, preserve lineage, avoid scandal. No wonder their empire ran on both discipline and decadence. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the chatter of the baths splashing water, laughter, the murmur of flirtation hidden in philosophical debates. Virtue and vice share the same steam. Somewhere, a poet dips his stylus into ink and writes about the beauty of a youth whose face glows brighter than marble. His words will survive centuries longer than their names. You leave the bathhouse, skin damp, mind buzzing. The marble floors gleam beneath the torchlight, and you sense something changing in the air, a faint tension between indulgence and guilt. The city's appetite feels boundless, but there's a shadow forming beyond the horizon. It comes not from within Rome, but from a faith that believes every act of pleasure must serve a higher purpose. It starts with a whisper, a rumor drifting through Roman villas and marketplaces. There's a new god in town, a god who doesn't dine with Jupiter, doesn't flirt with nymphs, and doesn't laugh at the same jokes. This god talks of sin and salvation, of humility and love that isn't carnal. And his followers, they meet in secret, by candlelight, breaking bread instead of laws. When the cross rose over the eagle, desire itself went on trial. At first, the empire barely notices. Rome has seen 1,000 gods before. What's one more? But Christianity isn't just another cult. It comes armed with moral geometry, a sharp division between body and soul, flesh and spirit. Pleasure is no longer practical. It's dangerous. You can almost feel the cultural tectonic plates shifting beneath your sandals. The early Christians inherit much from Judaism, including its suspicion of same-sex acts. In the Hebrew scriptures, sex exists to multiply, to fill the earth with children and secure the tribe's survival. Anything that fails, that purpose: homosexuality, masturbation, even contraception, is labeled wasteful. A rebellion against divine order, Christianity, born from Judaism's moral roots, carries that commandment into a new world hungry for order. St. Paul's letters make this crystal clear. In Romans 1:27, he condemns men burning in lust for one another as evidence of humanity's fall from God. To the Romans who hear this, it must sound like heresy against pleasure itself. But Paul isn't talking about disgust. He's talking about purpose. Every act must glorify the Creator, not the creature. To use your body for pure pleasure is to worship yourself, and in a faith built on self-denial. That's the ultimate idolatry. You can see why this idea spreads like wildfire through a weary empire. After centuries of decadence, civil wars, and plagues, Rome's citizens crave moral structure. They're tired of marble luxury and moral ambiguity. The Christian message: discipline, purity, eternity feels like fresh water after too much wine. For the poor, it promises equality before God. For the rich, it offers forgiveness. But for the sensual, it offers guilt. And guilt is powerful fuel for civilization. Augustine of Hippo, one of Christianity's sharpest minds, confesses in his Confessions that he once lived a life of lust and passion. His famous prayer, "Lord, make me chaste," but not yet sums up the entire struggle between old Rome and new faith. When Augustine finally embraces celibacy, He gives philosophical muscle to what Paul preached emotionally. Sex must serve procreation, or it serves sin. The human body becomes a battlefield between divine purpose and earthly pleasure. Contrast that with the old Roman mindset. For them, pleasure was a privilege. For Christians, it becomes a test. Rome said, control others. Christianity says, control yourself. Both systems revolve around power, but the second one moves it inward. The war shifts from social hierarchy to moral conscience. The Church's early fathers echo Augustine's ideas. Tertullian calls the body a temple not to be defiled. John Chrysostom describes same-sex love as worse than murder because it defies nature's design. Harsh words, yes, but they reflect a worldview obsessed with survival through obedience. A community that once prayed for rain now prays for restraint. The transformation is staggering. A society that once carved statues of nude gods now covers its saints in robes. The same empire that celebrated Antinous now venerates martyrs who die to resist temptation. Rome hasn't stopped worshiping beauty. It's just changed what kind of beauty it worships. Flesh turns from marble into metaphor. It's tempting to think of this as progress, but that would miss the point. Christianity didn't invent repression. It institutionalized it. It created a moral bureaucracy where desire had to file paperwork before being approved. Sex for pleasure denied. Sex for children permitted. Sex for love alone. Suspicious. Still, there's something deeply human in that struggle. The faith doesn't destroy longing, it sanctifies its denial. You can imagine early monks pacing their cells at night, haunted not by demons, but by their own memories of touch. Christianity gave people a vocabulary for guilt and redemption, but it also gave them solitude. Meanwhile, outside the monasteries, the city begins to change. Temples are torn down or converted into churches. Statues of Apollo and Ganymede crumble, replaced by icons of Mary and the saints. The laughter of bathhouses fades under the echo of hymns. Rome's stone heart hardens, but it beats for a new master now. You step into one of those early basilicas, cold, echoing, awash with incense. A priest chants about eternal life, while a fresco of Adam and Eve warns of the dangers of nakedness. The message is unmistakable. The body, once a playground, is now probation. The same desire that once built empires must now be confessed away. The empire has changed gods, but not instincts. The same passion that sculpted marble now fuels repentance. Rome still loves drama. It's just traded the theater for the altar. You walk out of that dim basilica into a world that feels heavier than before. The sun hasn't changed, but the gaze upon it has. Pleasure, once a natural part of being human, has become something to manage, confess, or suppress. Yet not everyone in the late empire gets the memo. The poets, as always, refuse to stay quiet. Take the silver-tongued Ovid, for instance, the man who turned flirting into literature. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, reads like a cheerful rebellion against all that sanctimonious restraint. He wrote about seduction with mathematical precision, teaching men and women alike how to win affection as if it were a civic skill. He joked about adulterers, mused about stolen kisses, and occasionally winked at same-sex liaisons. The empire's moral reformers hated him for it. Emperor Augustus eventually exiled Ovid to the edge of the Black Sea. where the only poetry left to write was regret. It's a fitting irony the poet who taught Rome to love was punished for reminding it how. Other writers like Juvenal and Martial had already immortalized Rome's contradictions, mocking the hypocrites who preached virtue by day and visited their young attendants by night. Martial's epigrams joked about senators hiding lovers behind curtains and generals who scolded soldiers for sins they themselves committed. These men weren't moral crusaders. They were cultural mirrors. Every laugh in their poetry reflected an uncomfortable truth the Romans couldn't decide whether to be ashamed or amused. And then there were the philosophers. Stoics like Seneca and Musonius Rufus began hinting at a moral discipline that foreshadowed Christianity's later teachings. They didn't condemn same-sex relations outright, but they stressed moderation, self-control, and the importance of reason over passion. To them, the real sin wasn't love. It was losing control. Sound familiar? It should. Those Stoic ideas would later fuse seamlessly with Christian ethics, giving the Church a framework that felt ancient yet holy. You might wonder how ordinary Romans reacted to this moral tug-of-war. The answer is inconsistently. Theaters still staged risque comedies, bathhouses still steamed with gossip, temples still echoed with prayers to Venus. But the tone was shifting. Pleasure was no longer a birthright. It was a liability. To enjoy too much meant tempting divine wrath. Even the gods began to fall silent. As Christianity spread, the old deities of love and beauty became awkward relics. Statues of Eros and Priapus were tucked away, their symbolism too suggestive for public spaces. But they didn't vanish completely. Farmers still buried small figurines in their fields for fertility. Sailors still whispered to Neptune before voyages. The sacred and the sensual had been intertwined for too long to separate cleanly. Do you see the paradox forming Rome? The empire that conquered half the known world now found itself conquered by an invisible empire of morality. It was no longer enough to obey laws. You had to police your own thoughts. Pleasure became a private battlefield. And yet, there's something almost comical in how human the contradictions remained. Augustine could write about divine chastity in the morning and recall his wild youth by evening. Priests who preached restraint often confessed the same sins they condemned. Even as the empire turned toward holiness, the human heart refused to evolve at the same pace. In that tension, art thrived, mosaics, sculptures, and verses from the late Roman period show a strange fusion, Christian halos drawn around faces that still look suspiciously pagan. The smile of a saint might resemble that of Antinous. The draped robes of the Virgin could echo those of Venus. The old world hadn't died, it had disguised itself in incense and Latin hymns. You stroll past a wall fresco of two wrestlers, muscles taut, eyes locked in something more than competition. The paint is cracked, but the emotion is clear admiration, rivalry, attraction all coiled into a single human moment. It's as if the artist painted desire knowing it would one day be forbidden. Rome may have changed its gods, but its artists didn't stop documenting truth. They just learned to whisper it in marble instead of shouting it in poetry. If you listen closely, you can almost hear Ovid laughing from exile. His voice floats across centuries. Teasing. You can exile the poet, but not the passion. Night settles over the empire like candle smoke. The once roaring baths fall silent, their marble pools drained, their laughter replaced by hymns echoing through basilicas. A century ago, Rome's greatest sin was losing a battle. Now, it's losing one's soul. The transformation is complete. The cross has conquered the eagle. Christianity isn't just a religion anymore. It's policy, law, and identity. When Emperor Constantine legalizes the faith in the 4th century, and Theodosius later makes it the empire's official creed, the rules of love change overnight. What once belonged to poets and philosophers now belongs to bishops and councils. The body becomes the church's jurisdiction, hooked by faith. Rome learns shame. Under Constantine's rule, Christian ethics seep into civil law. Same-sex relations, once a private matter, begin to attract moral scrutiny. By the reign of Theodosius, the line between sin and crime starts to blur. The empire that once carved naked gods in marble now condemns their flesh and blood imitators. In 390 CE, a decree orders that men found guilty of same-sex acts be burned alive. The punishment isn't merely physical, it's theological. A public cleansing of unnatural desire. You might pause here and ask, why such violence over love? The answer lies in survival, not malice, to early Christians. The future of their faith and humanity itself depended on reproduction. A tribe that didn't multiply would vanish. To waste seed on pleasure was to betray the Creator's design. Sex had one holy purpose: to create more souls for God. Anything else was heresy dressed in desire. It's a grim but oddly logical shift. In a world ravaged by disease, famine, and war, every birth feels like an act of resistance. Judaism had long enforced this rule: be fruitful and multiply. Christianity takes it further, making fertility a form of worship. In this worldview, same-sex love isn't just unconventional, it's sterile, a dead end. The sin isn't affection, it's futility. St. Augustine, now older and less conflicted, writes that lust without the intent of procreation is the corruption of love. He divides human impulses into two categories: caritas, love that builds the soul, and cupiditas, love that consumes it. Guess which one desire belongs to. His words become scripture for moral law, echoing through medieval sermons for the next 1,000 years. By the time you reach the 5th century, the difference between Roman and Christian is almost meaningless. Bishops wield more power than generals, and monasteries replace bathhouses as the empire's centers of reflection. But they're not so different as they appear. Both institutions obsess over discipline. The army drilled bodies, the church drills souls. Imagine an old Roman soldier walking through the streets of a now Christian Rome. The statues of Mars are gone, but he hears the same talk of duty, obedience, and purity. The language has changed, but the command hasn't: submit to authority. Only now, authority wears robes instead of armor. Still, conversion isn't instantaneous. In private, many Romans cling to their old habits. Historians find traces of resistance in graffiti, in satirical poems mocking bishops, and even in pagan festivals disguised as saints' days. The people still crave the warmth of their old freedoms, but fear has crept in. Guilt has become the new currency of control. Even emperors aren't immune. Justinian, ruling in the 6th century, tightens the laws further. His infamous edicts declare that same-sex relations call down earthquakes and famine upon the empire. Imagine blaming plate tectonics on desire. Yet, in a strange way, it works. Fear sanctified the law more effectively than love ever could. You can almost picture the shift, the sensual mosaics of Pompeii replaced by saints with solemn eyes, the laughter of taverns replaced by the toll of bells. The human body, once the pride of sculptors, becomes a reminder of weakness. Desire is no longer art, it's evidence for confession. And yet, even as Christianity reshapes the empire's soul, it borrows heavily from what it replaces. Church processions mirror pagan parades. Relics replace idols. Cathedrals rise where temples once stood. The old Rome doesn't vanish, it's baptized. As you walk through a monastery courtyard, a young monk passes, eyes cast downward, clutching a copy of the Psalms. You wonder if he ever looks up at the stars and thinks of the marble heroes who once stood where his chapel now stands. If he feels something stir inside a ghost of the old world whispering. Pleasure isn't sin, it's memory. But that whisper will soon be silenced by vows, candles, and the echoing hum of Gregorian chant. The empire's new voice speaks in Latin prayers, not love poems. The same civilization that once celebrated Ganymede now recites psalms about deliverance from temptation. And the rest of Europe is about to inherit this new moral empire. One law, one sermon, and one fear at a time. When Europe forgot how to bathe, it also forgot how to forgive. You cross from crumbling Rome into the misty forests of medieval Europe, and the change feels like stepping into another planet. The aqueducts have dried up, the marble baths are gone, and the chatter of poets has been replaced by the tolling of church bells. What used to be whispered gossip in the forum is now doctrine written in Latin. The empire has fallen, but its guilt has survived. This new world runs on faith and fear in equal measure. The church has become the great unifier of kingdoms and the gatekeeper of morality. From the monasteries of Ireland to the cathedrals of France, it decides what is holy, what is sinful, and what must never be spoken aloud. Rome once punished shame. Now, Europe sanctifies it. Inside the monastery walls, the struggle with desire becomes the monk's daily companion. Picture rows of men in brown habits, heads bowed, chanting psalms to drown out their own thoughts. The ascetic life is supposed to kill the flesh. But the flesh doesn't die quietly. Medieval theologians like St. Jerome and St. Benedict warn that even in sleep, temptation prowls. Jerome describes lust as a furnace that burns even in old age. Imagine confessing your dreams to your superior every morning just to stay pure. And it isn't only the monks. The clergy, those supposed pillars of morality, battle the same demons. In 11th century England, bishops issue decrees against priests keeping boys for sinful purposes. The irony stings the very institution that condemns same-sex desire, often hides it within its own walls. When the confessional replaces the forum, hypocrisy finds sanctuary. Still, the church's grip on the body grows tighter. Canon law now defines sodomy not as an act of dominance, but as a cosmic crime, a deliberate insult to God's design. No longer is the problem who plays which role. Now the entire act is heresy. The logic is theological. If God made man and woman for procreation, then two men together unmake creation. It's not merely indecent, it's apocalyptic. That's how a private act becomes a public threat. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, the most brilliant mind of the scholastic age, places same-sex acts among the peccata contra naturam sins against nature itself. To him, The order of nature reflects the order of heaven. Disrupt one, and you endanger the other. His arguments will echo for centuries, repeated from pulpits long after his bones have turned to dust. Out in the villages, people hear these ideas secondhand, often distorted by fear. The peasants don't quote Aquinas. They quote the priest who says the next plague or famine is God's punishment for hidden vice. And so, suspicion becomes survival. Neighbors watch each other. Boys accused of unnatural affection vanish into dungeons or stake fires. What was once comedy in juveniles' verses is now tragedy in church records. You might ask yourself, how did laughter turn into flame? Part of it is power. When spiritual purity defines social order, fear becomes the easiest form of control. Kings depend on priests to bless their reigns. Priests depend on kings to enforce divine law. Together, they build a world where obedience equals salvation. There's no room for ambiguity. Desire, unpredictable as it is, becomes the perfect enemy. And yet, even here, desire refuses to die. Monks write letters to one another laced with tenderness. Troubadours sing songs of forbidden love that slip between the cracks of doctrine. In the great abbeys, illuminated manuscripts hide marginal drawings of men embracing a silent rebellion in ink and gold. The body is still there, hiding beneath layers of robes and rules, waiting for the right century to breathe again. You wander into a medieval church, its air thick with incense. The stained glass filters light into blues and reds so vivid, they almost hurt your eyes. A priest preaches about the fires of Sodom, his voice echoing off stone. Yet on the far wall, a sculptor, perhaps inspired by something he dare not name, carves two saints whose gazes meet a little too tenderly. The congregation never notices, but the artist does. By the time the sermon ends, you realize the Middle Ages didn't destroy desire, they buried it alive. The soil above it is packed with prayer, fear, and centuries of silence. But silence is never permanent. Even in the darkest cloister, someone is still whispering the language of the forbidden. The cobblestones under your feet are slick with rain, and the air smells of smoke and incense. You've left the monastery walls behind and stepped into the town square of medieval Europe, a place where gossip travels faster than the church bell. Here, morality isn't confined to theology anymore. It's law, punishment, and theater. And the audience always demands a show. The church has written the script, but secular rulers are eager to perform it. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the crime once whispered in confession now carries a public sentence. Sodomy, a word stretched to cover everything from same-sex relations to adultery to any act deemed unnatural, is prosecuted with brutal enthusiasm. In Italy, France, and England, civic courts echo with sermons disguised as verdicts. It's hard to overstate how theatrical punishment becomes. Public executions aren't merely about deterrence, they're about purification. The crowd gathers, prayers are sung, and flames roar beneath a wooden stake as though hell itself has come for a preview. The message is simple: repent through fear. The same empire that once built bathhouses now builds bonfires. And yet, beneath this pious fury lies something painfully familiar: curiosity. The same people who condemn the accused can't look away. It's human nature dressed in piety. Moral panic always carries a hint of fascination. Preachers thunder about sin, but their words linger on details a little too long, their eyes shining with both disgust and intrigue. You can almost hear Juvenal laughing from the grave. One of the earliest laws targeting homosexuality appears in 13th century France, where King Louis X, later canonized as Saint Louis, orders executions for sins against nature. England soon follows. The Buggery Act of 1533, passed under Henry VIII, officially criminalizes unnatural acts, making them punishable by death. The irony, of course, is that Henry himself broke nearly every other moral commandment on the list. But hypocrisy, like sin, never seems to go out of fashion. By now, Europe has perfected its moral machinery. The Inquisition, founded to hunt heretics, quickly extends its reach to sexual deviance. Accusations become currency, and confession, once private, becomes spectacle. It's no longer enough to control actions. The Church wants thoughts, dreams, and fantasies under its authority too. If you so much as flinch during a sermon about Sodom, someone might notice. The fear isn't limited to individuals. Entire cities suffer under waves of hysteria. When plague hits Florence or famine strikes England, preachers cry that God's wrath has been stirred by the abominations of men. Nature itself becomes a moral scoreboard. An earthquake that must be the work of sin. A poor harvest, clearly divine punishment for the secret desires of strangers. But even here, cracks appear in the wall of certainty. Some scholars within the Church begin to question whether all sins of the flesh deserve the same fire. Quietly, theologians debate intent, temptation, and mercy. Thomas Aquinas, centuries earlier, had tried to rank sins logically. Now, others ask if compassion might rank higher than logic. Their ideas remain whispers for now, smothered by the roar of orthodoxy. But those whispers will one day ignite reform. And while the Church polices pleasure, life continues in strange contradictions. The same monasteries that punish carnal acts also produce illuminated manuscripts filled with delicate artistry. The same bishops who condemn unnatural desire commission paintings of angels, so beautiful they blur the line between divine and sensual. Medieval Europe can't stop aestheticizing the very thing it fears. Do you notice the pattern every time desire is outlawed? Art finds a loophole. Painters, poets, and architects translate forbidden emotion into beauty. Cathedrals rise like frozen prayers, their spires straining toward heaven, while gargoyles half beast, half man grin from the shadows below. They're the perfect metaphor for the age purity and temptation sharing the same wall. It's tempting to judge the Middle Ages harshly, but remember, fear was their survival instinct. The Black Death, wars, and famine made the world feel fragile. To people who lost half their families in a single year, sin wasn't an abstract concept, it was cause and effect. If God could flood the earth in Genesis, he could surely strike Europe with plague for moral decay. It wasn't cruelty that built the pyres, it was desperation. Still, somewhere under the ashes, Rome's old pragmatism flickers. The language of dominance and hierarchy hasn't disappeared entirely. It's just been sanctified. Monks still talk about conquering the flesh. Knights about defending virtue. It's the same old obsession control, just wearing a crucifix instead of a laurel crown. As the fire dies in the square, the priest blesses the crowd, and they disperse, stepping over the charred wood as if it were normal. And perhaps it is. In a century that mistakes punishment for purity, the flames may fade, but the smoke will linger for generations, floating into every cathedral, every sermon, every conscience. You walk away, the smell of burnt oak clinging to your clothes, wondering how a civilization that once sculpted love in marble ended up sculpting fear instead. You wake to the sound of bells again, softer this time, less warning than remembrance. Europe has settled into its long medieval rhythm. The fires in the town square have dimmed, but their echo lives on in whispers. In this world, silence becomes both shield and confession. What was once open in Roman gardens now hides behind monastery walls. Coded poems and glances exchanged in candlelight. Hooked on fear, society learns to speak in symbols. Inside those monasteries, affection survives, but it must disguise itself as brotherly love. Letters between monks read like theological essays on friendship, but pulse with something warmer. A 12th century abbot named Aelred of Rievaulx writes spiritual friendship, describing love between men as a reflection of divine union. His words shimmer with devotion, tenderness, and restraint, a balancing act between faith and longing. He dares to suggest that friendship itself could be holy, even when the heart behind it trembles for something more. Outside the cloister, poets take up the cause. The troubadours of southern France, those wandering lyricists with lutes and soft rebellion, compose songs of fin amour or refined love. Their verses celebrate passion as a noble suffering, an ache that purifies the soul. Though their audiences imagine knights and ladies, the metaphors of forbidden desire are elastic. Behind those coded lines, emotion finds refuge. You can almost hear Ovid chuckling again. Even the Middle Ages couldn't silence love. They just changed its wardrobe. Art joins the rebellion too. In the illuminated margins of prayer books, monks doodle strange little scenes, two men exchanging flowers, angels holding hands, creatures with ambiguous faces. Some of these details might be jokes, others quiet acts of remembrance. It's as if the artists are whispering across centuries. We're still here. And yet, secrecy is exhausting. Imagine living your whole life translating your heart into metaphor. The danger isn't only external, it seeps inward. A priest who loves another priest calls it temptation. A knight who loves his squire calls it loyalty. They rename their affection until it sounds holy. But under the pious phrasing, the feeling remains unmistakable. That double life breeds its own kind of poetry. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, places sodomites among the damned. Yet he writes of them with startling compassion. He meets his former mentor, Brunetto Latini, in the Inferno not with scorn, but with respect. Their conversation is tender, almost fatherly. Dante weeps when they part. You can feel the author's uneased loyalty to doctrine pulling against loyalty to memory. The church may condemn, but the poet still mourns. Do you see the irony? By defining love as sin, the medieval mind gives it a kind of immortality. Forbidden affection becomes art, confession, and myth all at once. Every rule spawns a metaphor. Every silence births a song. Still, not everyone hides forever. In 14th century England, a priest named John Wycliffe begins questioning the church's authority, sparking intellectual tremors that will later erupt into Reformation. Among his followers are thinkers who challenge not just dogma, but the church's obsession with controlling private life. The door to doubt creaks open. It will take centuries for it to swing wide. but the air already smells different, less of incense, more of inquiry. Meanwhile, Europe keeps painting saints with sad eyes, building cathedrals that scrape the heavens, and policing passions it can never fully contain. The same hands that pen sermons about purity also carve cherubs whose faces look suspiciously human. Love has gone underground, but it still glows like embers beneath ash. Imagine a cloister at night. The monks sleep in narrow cells, each separated by a curtain. A single candle flickers at the altar, its flame bending in the draught. Somewhere, someone stirs, half awake. Haunted not by demons, but by memory, the warmth of another's hand years ago. The echo of laughter before the vows. He prays for deliverance, but part of him prays never to forget. That's the contradiction medieval faith can't resolve. To purge desire is to purge humanity itself. And despite 1,000 sermons, humanity refuses to vanish. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the ink of secret poets and the art of bold painters begin to loosen Europe's tongue again. But before the sunlight breaks, this long night of whispering must play itself out, century after century of guilt, devotion, and coded love letters hidden in hymnals. The Forum may have crumbled into dust, but its echoes still argue with the cathedrals. You stand now on the bridge between worlds, Rome behind you, modernity ahead. The marble empire that once ruled with laws of dominance has dissolved into legend, while the Christian Europe that replaced it still carries the weight of its theology. Yet in a strange way, both civilizations live inside us. Their ghosts share space in every argument about morality, freedom, and love. Rome's leniency toward homosexuality was never born of compassion. It was a structure built on hierarchy. Power excused pleasure as long as it reinforced status. Men ruled not only the state, but the very terms of intimacy. When that world collapsed and Christianity rose, the hierarchy didn't vanish, it simply turned inward. The battlefield moved from the bedroom to the conscience. The new empire ruled souls instead of citizens. That's why, if you look closely, the medieval monk and the Roman senator have more in common than you'd think. One polices others, the other polices himself. Both fear the loss of control. The difference lies in the direction of the shame. Rome punished weakness. Christianity punished desire. Two sides of the same obsession, power disguised as virtue. You can trace this evolution like a river through time. In ancient marble, desire was physical, transactional, woven into daily life. In medieval stone, it was spiritualized and suppressed, bound by guilt. Each society mirrored its god. Jupiter demanded tribute through action. Christ demanded surrender through purity. Both left the human heart conflicted, half yearning, half afraid. Think about how those old ideas still echo today. When modern laws or moral debates circle around sexuality, they're not new arguments, they're translations of ancient ones. The Roman question of dominance, who's in control, has morphed into the Christian question of purpose. What's this for? Whether whispered in Senate halls or preached from pulpits, the language of judgment has always circled the same unease, how to manage what we can't help feeling. You might recall St. Paul's words in Romans 7:19. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. It's the cry of a man torn between law and longing, faith and flesh, 2 millennia later. That tension still hums beneath every society's rules about love. Maybe that's why stories of forbidden affection never lose their grip. They're mirrors for the human condition itself. Across history, new faces appear. Michelangelo painting the male form with divine tenderness. Shakespeare writing sonnets to a fair youth. Even the quiet persistence of friendship celebrated by Christian mystics. Each age tries to reconcile the irreconcilable, the holiness of love and the politics of control. Rome taught the West to glorify power. The Church taught it to fear pleasure. Between them, we've spent 2,000 years negotiating a truce between pride and guilt. And every now and then, humanity remembers what both empires forgot: that love, however it arrives, resists ownership. You look around at the modern world, proud, conflicted, still arguing in forums of a different kind. Pride parades march through streets that once hosted crusades. Debates rage on television instead of in cathedrals. Science explains what Scripture once warned about. Yet the emotional weight remains the same. Our language has changed. Our longings haven't. Maybe that's what makes history both tragic and beautiful. It never truly ends. The Romans sought pleasure without shame. The Christians sought purity without compromise. Both failed, because both misunderstood that love is not a problem to be solved. It's a mirror we keep polishing, hoping one day to see only virtue staring back. You take one last glance at the ruins of the Forum. The marble columns rise like broken ribs against the sky. Birds nest where senators once debated, and tourists whisper where preachers once thundered. The empire is gone. The church has changed. But the question remains: how much of what we call morality is just the fear of our own reflection? As the evening light spills over stone and shadow, you realize that Rome's leniency and Europe's intolerance were never opposites. They were chapters in the same human story. Power sought order, faith sought meaning, and desire kept breaking both. The bells ring again, faint but clear. You listen, not to choose between the Forum and the cathedral, but to understand them. Both still whisper the same message in different tongues: control what you love, or love what you can't control. And somewhere in between marble and prayer, between empire and eternity, you finally hear what history has been trying to say all along. Love survives every law that tries to contain it. As the Roman Empire faded and Christianity took root, Europe's view of the body changed forever. What had once been seen as natural appetite became moral trial. Pleasure lost its neutrality. Desire required purpose. Sex was no longer civic recreation, but divine responsibility redefined through faith. Fear, and the Church's new command to sanctify every touch in service of God. You step into a Roman bathhouse at dusk, steam rising like ghosts of perfume and sweat. The marble floor is slick beneath your sandals, and laughter echoes between the columns. Men and women lounge half-dressed, gossiping, eating figs, sharing wine, and discussing politics with the same ease they discuss lovers. It smells of oil, incense, and a kind of confident fleshly happiness. You can almost hear the gods chuckling from their marble perches above Venus. Bacchus, Apollo, patrons of beauty, love, and pleasure. In this world, the human body isn't shameful. It's divine architecture. You are meant to admire it, to use it, to celebrate it. But somewhere, far from the noise of the baths, Another world is stirring. A preacher in coarse linen walks dusty roads across Judea, talking about purity, humility, and a kingdom not of this earth. His followers eat simply, wash each other's feet, and speak of the soul as more important than the skin. No one realizes it yet. But this small movement, barefoot and poor, will someday overthrow Rome's entire moral system. For centuries, Roman pleasure was a civic duty. Festivals like Lupercalia, where men in goatskins chased women through the streets to ensure fertility, were considered healthy, not scandalous. The gods demanded joy. Austerity was for barbarians. If you were a Roman man, you might visit your wife for family honor and your slave for fun. There was no contradiction. The act mattered less than your status. Morality was a ladder, not a compass. The powerful could indulge. The weak were expected to obey. Yet history has a sense of irony. The empire that conquered the world would eventually be conquered by an idea, one that said, "Blessed are the pure in heart." You begin to see the cracks form when Roman writers like Seneca and Juvenal start mocking their own city's excesses. Seneca, a Stoic philosopher, warned that desire was a disease of the mind, a chain that bound reason. He didn't know it, but he was already speaking the early Christian language of restraint, guilt, and the need for spiritual hygiene. When the apostles began spreading Christianity through Roman roads, they weren't only preaching salvation, they were offering something else: certainty. In a world of many gods, each demanding offerings and rituals, Christianity promised one truth, one law, one moral compass. And it started with the body. St. Paul, writing to the Corinthians, didn't mince words: flee from sexual immorality. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit? That line landed like a thunderclap in a culture that had spent centuries treating bodies as public property. Imagine you're a Roman merchant, used to attending lavish feasts where dancers perform half-naked and wine flows endlessly. Then you meet a group of people who dine quietly, refuse to toast to Jupiter, and speak of love as something sacred, not sensual. They greet each other with peace, not passion. To you, they seem strange, almost unworldly. And yet, there's something magnetic about their discipline. In an empire drowning in indulgence, their restraint feels powerful. The early Christians didn't just challenge Roman pleasure, they redefined virtue. Where Rome prized dominance, Christianity prized humility. Where Rome saw physical beauty as divine favor, Christianity saw it as a test of the soul. In Roman art, gods flaunted their naked forms. In Christian art, holiness began to glow through covered robes and downcast eyes. The ideal shifted from the chiseled athlete to the modest saint. Still, the transition wasn't instant. Old habits die slowly, especially when they're enjoyable. Pagan traditions kept bleeding into Christian life like dye in water. Some converts attended church in the morning and temple orgies by night. Others baptized their children and still made offerings to Venus, just in case. Christianity's early centuries were less about moral perfection than about moral negotiation. What do you keep, and what do you sacrifice? When your faith demands purity, but your culture rewards pleasure. Even emperors couldn't escape the shift. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, reportedly delayed his baptism until his deathbed, perhaps because he knew that to be baptized meant to renounce much of what made Rome Rome: its appetite, its grandeur, its casual sin. When the empire officially adopted Christianity in the 4th century, It wasn't just the temples that changed. The very heartbeat of daily life, how people loved, married, and even thought about desire, began to slow, then harden. Yet, imagine the confusion. For a Roman accustomed to gods who partied harder than mortals, the new faith must have seemed like cosmic whiplash. Suddenly, laughter had limits. Nudity became shame. A woman's hair, once a symbol of allure, was now something to cover. Even the art shifted from celebration to sermon. The same marble that once sculpted Venus bathing now carved Mary praying. But beneath the solemn hymns and incense smoke, there was still an echo of the old world people trying to reconcile the pleasure of being human with the fear of being sinful. And that's where the real tension began, between the body that lived in Rome and the soul that dreamed of heaven. The Roman calendar once read like a party planner's dream. Every few weeks, another festival arrived: Saturnalia, Bacchanalia, Floralia, each an excuse for music, costumes, and mischief. You could trade clothes with your slaves, drink until dawn, and shout poetry that would make your grandmother faint. Even senators joined the fun. It wasn't debauchery to them. It was devotion. The gods wanted to see their people rejoice, not repent. Now, picture what happens when that world collides with Christianity. Suddenly, the very joy that held Roman society together becomes suspect. A sermon replaces a song. The laughter of Saturnalia turns into the silence of Lent. And you, standing somewhere between the two, can feel the moral temperature drop. In the late Empire, church fathers like St. Augustine looked upon those festivals with a mix of horror and nostalgia. Augustine knew temptation firsthand. Before becoming Bishop of Hippo, he'd spent years chasing pleasure through Carthage's taverns and theaters. Later, in Confessions, he wrote of those nights as chains around his soul. He called lust a storm within. When he condemned the wild feasts of Saturnalia, he wasn't just attacking pagan culture, he was wrestling his younger self. But for ordinary Romans, these festivals were community life. Saturnalia wasn't just about excess, it was social release. For 1 week each winter, hierarchy vanished. Slaves dined with masters, gifts were exchanged. People laughed at authority and remembered, briefly, that everyone was mortal. Christianity, with its stricter hierarchy of sin and salvation, replaced that momentary equality with something quieter shared guilt. Still, transitions are rarely tidy. In many towns, Saturnalia didn't disappear, it mutated. Priests tried to Christianize the festivities. They placed nativity plays where drunken parades had been. They swapped garlands for candles, pagan songs for hymns. Even Christmas, set conveniently near the old Roman solstice festivals, carried echoes of Saturn's laughter under the choir's harmony. And yet, something fundamental changed the tone. The Romans had once worshipped life in all its messiness. Christianity began to worship restraint. Imagine walking through a city square that once hosted revelers dancing around fires and finding instead a bishop preaching repentance. The wine amphorae are gone. In their place, an altar. You can almost hear the clash between cymbals and church bells. St. John Chrysostom, whose name literally means golden-mouthed, became one of the loudest critics of the old revels. Where Christ is, there is no dance. He warned his flock in Antioch. His sermons dripped with disappointment. Why would God's children imitate beasts? He asked, chasing pleasure like dogs after scraps to him. Saturnalia was a moral infection. Every giggle, every jug of wine, a step closer to damnation. Not everyone agreed. Some early Christians quietly mourned the loss of joy. A monk named Tertullian complained that Christians had become sour-faced. He argued that laughter itself wasn't sinful, only what you laughed at. But by then, laughter was already under suspicion. If the body was a temple, then humor was graffiti on its walls. Even the way people dressed began to shift. During Saturnalia, bright robes and flower crowns had symbolized abundance. Christian modesty, however, preferred plainness. Color faded from daily life, both in fabric and philosophy. The Romans once painted their statues. Medieval Christians left theirs white. It wasn't just marble that lost its blush. Europe itself was learning to look serious. You can imagine the confusion of an old Roman grandmother seeing her grandchildren baptized into this new world, one that taught them to feel guilty for enjoying what had once been holy. She might whisper to herself, "The gods used to love our laughter," and maybe she'd be right. Yet, Christianity didn't only subtract, it replaced. The old festivals of indulgence made way for new rituals of reflection. Fasting replaced feasting. Confession replaced carousing. Instead of toasting Bacchus, believers broke bread in memory of Christ. Even the calendar itself became a moral map. Advent, Lent, Easter, each season marked not by celebration of nature, but by discipline of spirit. If Saturnalia was a mirror of human joy, Lent became a mirror of human weakness. For the first time, Europe was taught that suffering could be beautiful, that denying yourself could make you holy. It's a lesson that still echoes through the centuries, one that shaped not just religion, but the very rhythm of European life. Still, deep down, the memory of Saturnalia never truly died. You can feel it resurface each year in Carnival, in Mardi Gras, in the strange urge to dance before repentance. Because even after centuries of sermons, the human heart remembers how to laugh. It's as if some ancient Roman spirit whispers, "Rejoice before you repent." And so, from saints to masquerades, from hymns to hidden laughter, Europe began its long balancing act between two worlds, one that celebrated flesh and one that feared it. Somewhere between the laughter of the last festival and the hush of the first cathedral, a war begins not with swords or spears, but inside the human heart. The body, once adored, becomes a suspect. You can almost feel the air tighten as bishops and philosophers turn the body into a battlefield between heaven and hell. You, standing in that uneasy silence, might wonder, when did desire become dangerous? In the old Roman world, lust was like fire, it could burn. Yes, but it also kept you warm. Now, under Christian teaching, it becomes a spark that threatens to burn the entire soul. St. Paul had already warned, it is better to marry than to burn. By the Middle Ages, that verse would echo like law. Early Christian thinkers, especially the Church Fathers, built an entire theology around that single fear that pleasure, though natural, was also the devil's fingerprint. St. Jerome once declared, "Whoever too ardently loves his wife is an adulterer." Try explaining that at a wedding reception. What Jerome meant wasn't that love was sinful, but that even within marriage, passion must be tamed. The new moral code didn't forbid sex outright. It tried to put it on a leash, one sanctified by God and guarded by guilt. You see the tension everywhere. In the writings of Augustine, that storm-tossed bishop of Hippo. The body becomes a restless animal, dragging the soul by the collar. He confessed, "I was bound not by another man's irons, but by my own iron will." His struggle with temptation wasn't private, it became doctrine. From his guilt was born a Europe that viewed pleasure as an infection to be managed, not a gift to be embraced. And yet, here's the irony: by obsessing over desire, the church made it impossible to ignore. Every sermon about sin became a reminder of what not to think about, which naturally made people think about it. Medieval monks wrote long, careful treatises describing what impure thoughts one should avoid, in excruciating detail. One might say repression made imagination Europe's favorite sin. Meanwhile, ordinary believers tried to navigate this new battlefield. Imagine being a farmer in 5th century Gaul, told that the same act that gives you children might also anger heaven if done with too much joy. How much is too much? No one could say. The church offered confession, but not clarity. Desire became a fog when everyone was breathing. No one dared to name. Still, some thinkers tried to reconcile flesh and faith. St. Ambrose taught that the body wasn't evil, it just needed discipline, like a restless horse guided by reins. Others went further, suggesting that controlling desire was a way to imitate Christ's self-denial. The Roman ideal of strength had been physical muscles, beauty, conquest. The Christian ideal became invisible patience, restraint, obedience. You no longer proved your worth by how many lovers you had, but by how many temptations you resisted. That shift changed more than morality. It rewired psychology. Before, shame came from failure in society, being poor, weak, or dishonored. Now, shame came from within, from what you thought. The battlefield had moved behind your eyes. A bishop could command your conscience more effectively than any emperor could command your army. Art changed, too. The sensual mosaics of Pompeii gave way to solemn frescoes of saints enduring temptation. Where once Venus rose from the sea, now St. Anthony battled demons in the desert. The difference was clear: the human body no longer represented beauty. It represented risk. To gaze too long at it, even in marble, was to court spiritual disaster. It's tempting to laugh at the contrast. Imagine a Roman god of wine suddenly waking up in medieval Europe. He'd think everyone had joined a very dull after-party. Yet this seriousness carried power. Christianity offered what paganism never could: moral certainty. It drew a bright line where once there had been only gradients. For the first time, the body and the soul were locked in a hierarchy, and the soul was declared the rightful king. Still, the body doesn't surrender easily. You can sense it in medieval confessions, in whispered prayers, in the desperate pleas for forgiveness that sound suspiciously human. For every sermon on purity, there were 10 sinners sneaking glances during Mass. The battlefield was bloody but invisible. So, as Europe turned inward, learning to mistrust its own hungers, the stage was set for a new institution to rise, one that would claim authority not only over the heart, but over the home itself. And that institution was marriage. The bells ring for a wedding, but this time they sound less like celebration and more like a warning. For better or worse. The priest intones, and you can't help but notice how much weight the worst part suddenly carries. The union before you isn't just between two people anymore. It's between two souls, signed and sealed under divine surveillance. Marriage in the Roman world had been practical, almost businesslike. Families arranged matches for power, land, or lineage. Love was a pleasant bonus, not a requirement. A wife managed the home, a husband managed politics, and neither expected the other to be a saint. The system worked. If you ignored the occasional mistress, concubine, or scandalous affair, which, frankly, everyone did. But with Christianity's rise, the contract of marriage was rewritten literally. What had once been a civic matter became a sacred mystery. By the time the medieval church formalized it as a sacrament, every kiss, every touch, every shared bed carried spiritual weight. The bedchamber was no longer private, it was under heaven's jurisdiction. Rome once built aqueducts to carry water. Christianity built confessionals to carry guilt. And nowhere did that guilt flow more heavily than into marriage. St. Augustine again looms large here. In his teaching, even marital sex was permitted only for procreation. To enjoy it too much was to risk sin. Pleasure was tolerated, not celebrated. You could say love was placed on probation. Augustine's logic was simple but severe since humanity fell through desire. Desire must be restrained to keep us from falling again. Adam and Eve had eaten the fruit. Now all their descendants were on a divine diet. The church went further, establishing marriage debt, the idea that spouses owed each other intimacy, but only as a duty, not for delight. Refusal could even be considered sinful. But so could enthusiasm. Try balancing that. Manuals for confessors began listing the approved times and reasons for marital union. Sunday number, holy days, definitely not. Advent, Lent, or fast days, forget it. The calendar of saints became, unintentionally, a calendar of abstinence. And yet, even within this framework, marriage offered new dignity, especially for women. The church insisted that both partners consent, something Roman law hadn't required. The idea of mutual spiritual responsibility slowly replaced the old notion of possession. For the first time, a wife's soul was seen as equal to her husband's, even if her social power wasn't. Marriage became not just a contract, but a covenant, an echo of Christ and his church. Still, the double standard persisted. Men confessed lust as weakness. Women confessed it as corruption. The Virgin Mary was held up as the model of perfection, pure, obedient, untouched. Real women, understandably, couldn't compete. Every wife was measured against an impossible ideal. The result? A world where devotion to Mary coexisted with suspicion toward her daughters. You can sense how deeply this reshaped European society. The Roman home, once full of laughter and open courtyards, gradually became a closed sanctum of moral discipline. Sex, once casual, turned into ceremony. A kiss that used to seal a deal now required divine permission. Even newlyweds found themselves praying after consummation, not for joy, but for forgiveness. And yet, not everyone accepted this quietly. Some thinkers like Peter Abelard and his lover Heloise in the 12th century argued that passion and faith could coexist. Their letters are full of desperate tenderness. What is holy cannot destroy what is human, Heloise wrote, but theirs was a rare voice in a chorus of caution. The church's official stance stayed clear. Pleasure could be tolerated only if it wore the mask of duty. Over time, this moral framework hardened into law. Priests recorded marriages, bishops annulled them. Popes set the rules. What had once been personal became political. By controlling marriage, the church controlled inheritance, alliances, and even kings. Think of Henry VIII centuries later. Breaking from Rome just to escape that control, it wasn't just about love or lust, but sovereignty over the soul itself. For ordinary believers, though, the result was simpler but heavier. They lived under the constant gaze of heaven. Marriage was holy, but fragile. One false step, one wrong thought, one night of too much affection, and sin crept in through the sheets. You start to understand why confession became the spiritual plumbing of Europe. Everyone needed a release valve. By now, the body and its appetites had been fenced in by holy law. But in the shadows of that moral garden, another story began to grow, one that wasn't about men's strength or priests' authority, but about women themselves, and the strange mix of worship and fear that Christianity wrapped around them. You wake up in a medieval village and hear the church bells ring a familiar rhythm by now. But today, the sermon isn't about marriage or fasting. It's about women. The preacher's voice rises through the morning mist, warning of temptation that wears a smile and a braid. You glance at the faces around you. The men nod gravely. The women keep their eyes down. In early Christian thought, womanhood became a paradox, half salvation, half scandal. From Eve's fateful bite to Mary's immaculate faith, the story of sin and redemption was carried on female shoulders. Christianity didn't invent this tension, but it magnified it. In the Roman world, women had been decorative, sometimes powerful, often objectified. In the Christian world, they became moral symbols, either the cause or the cure of male desire. Take Eve. For centuries, theologians blamed her for humanity's fall. Tertullian called women the devil's gateway. He didn't mean it as poetry. Eve's hunger for knowledge was recast as lust, her curiosity as disobedience. Every woman since, it was said, carried that dangerous spark, a reminder that beauty could betray, that softness could destroy. You can almost hear the whisper echo through every confession booth. Remember Eve, and yet, standing on the other side of that divide, shines Mary, the Virgin, the Mother, the counterbalance to Eve's rebellion. In Mary, the church found its perfect woman obedient, silent, and untouched. Her purity became not just admired, but institutionalized. Painters depicted her in blue robes and downcast eyes, her very posture preaching submission, to be holy. A woman had to be like Mary, and to be like Mary, she had to be everything a normal woman was not. Imagine how impossible that standard must have felt. If you were a medieval woman, your moral worth was a scale balanced between Eve's curiosity and Mary's chastity. Too loud, too clever, too confident, and you risked being Eve again. Too quiet, too invisible, and no one noticed your virtue. Either way, the church watched. Yet not all women bowed to this script. Some carved out power precisely through the ideals meant to contain them. Saints like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composed music and wrote theology that male scholars quoted for centuries. She spoke of divine visions in which the soul was feminine and the voice of God thundered through her. Others, like St. Catherine of Siena, advised popes and kings while living lives of fierce celibacy. They turned the virgin ideal into armor, using purity as a weapon of authority. Still, for every Hildegard, thousands of ordinary women lived under suspicion. The church taught that female beauty could provoke sin merely by existing. Veils became virtue. Hair, once the symbol of allure in Roman culture, was hidden under linen and coifs. The modesty wasn't just fashion, it was theology. To reveal was to tempt. To tempt was to sin. You can see how this fear of temptation bled into art and literature. Medieval bestiaries warned of sirens luring men to their doom. Preachers compared women's eyes to snares, their perfume to poison. Desire became a moral crime scene, and the woman, by default, the suspect. Even love stories carried cautionary undertones. Think of Guinevere and Lancelot, their doomed affairs standing as a warning carved into legend. And yet, in secret corners of Europe, another current flowed. Troubadours in southern France sang of courtly love, where a man's devotion to a noble lady became almost religious. He serves her as a knight serves God, one poet wrote. It was an odd rebellion glorifying women while keeping them unreachable. The lady was adored, but only from afar. In a strange way, courtly love preserved the virgin ideal. It simply set it to music. You might wonder, why did the church tolerate this double image? Perhaps because it worked. By elevating women to sacred symbols, it could also contain them. A woman could inspire holiness, but never lead it. Even nuns, those who renounced the world, lived under male authority. The church called them brides of Christ. But Christ, inconveniently, never asked their opinion. Still, you sense the quiet defiance in their prayers. Medieval convents became havens of literacy and learning. One of the few places where women could read, write, and think freely. Behind those stone walls, they copied manuscripts, composed poetry, and dreamed. Some even spoke of mystical union with God in language so passionate that confessors blushed. They couldn't express love in flesh, so they turned it into theology. By the High Middle Ages, Europe had internalized this paradox woman as the guardian of purity, and also its greatest threat. The Virgin Mary looked down from every cathedral fresco, while Eve's shadow crept beneath every sermon. Together, they defined the moral imagination of a continent. And as monasteries grew and cities hummed, another movement began to rise, one that took the suspicion of the flesh to its logical extreme, the belief that the holiest life was one without desire at all. You walk through a narrow stone passage lit by candles and hear nothing but the shuffle of sandals. A bell tolls. The air smells of wax and cold bread. This is not a palace or a fortress, it's a monastery. The new kingdom of silence. You've entered a world where the greatest victory isn't over nations, but over your own flesh. The monks who built these walls weren't running from war or taxes. They were fleeing themselves. To early Christians, the desert had become the testing ground of the soul. The first monks, like Anthony of Egypt, retreated into wastelands to fight temptation head-on. They called their struggles spiritual warfare, but their enemies were hunger, loneliness, and lust. If Rome had built legions of soldiers, Christianity built legions of celibates. Inside these cloisters, desire is treated like a wild animal. You don't feed it, you don't pet it, you keep it caged through fasting, prayer, and work. The rhythm of the day becomes a form of defense wake at dawn. Chant, toil, study, sleep, repeat. The body obeys the bell, not the heart. Monastic rules, like those of Saint Benedict, laid it out plainly: moderation in food, silence in speech, chastity in life. Even laughter was considered dangerous. It opened the door to carelessness, which might open the door to sin. And yet, the discipline of monasteries wasn't purely grim. There's a strange peace in this world of self-denial. Imagine copying a manuscript by hand, your ink scratching parchment as the wind hums through the cloister garden. You can almost forget the noise of markets, the temptations of flesh, the chaos of kings. To medieval minds, monks weren't repressed, they were heroes. Every passion resisted was a victory for heaven. Still, human nature doesn't vanish behind stone. The Church's archives are full of confessions and punishments for failures of the vow. Some monks whispered to each other under candlelight. Some nuns wrote love letters disguised as prayers. Even the holiest communities had their scandals. And when they did, the Church reacted with the same mix of horror and fascination that would define Europe's view of sex for centuries: condemn it publicly, obsess over it privately. Think about what this meant for the wider world. The monastic ideal: celibacy, self-control, detachment became the gold standard for holiness. The priesthood adopted it. By the 12th century, marriage was banned for clergy in the Western Church. The message was clear: to serve God, you must surrender your body. Rome once glorified generals who conquered enemies. Now it glorified men who conquered desire. You can see the irony forming again. The old Roman gods had celebrated fertility. Now, the Christian gods seem to prefer barrenness, virginity over motherhood, solitude over marriage. Monasteries multiplied across Europe, dotting the landscape like moral fortresses. Peasants donated land to them. Kings sought their prayers before battle. These quiet communities became both conscience and backbone of the continent. And yet, outside the walls, ordinary people began to feel an odd dissonance. If holiness meant rejecting the flesh, what did that make the rest of humanity, those who married, who loved, who longed? Were they condemned simply for being alive? The Church tried to soften the message: marriage was good, but celibacy was better. The hierarchy of virtue was born, and it placed the most human parts of life squarely in second place. But the monasteries also kept something precious alive: knowledge. While Europe's cities crumbled, monks preserved ancient texts, including the pagan philosophers Christianity had once scorned. They copied Plato and Aristotle alongside the Gospels, almost as if unconsciously keeping the old world breathing. In their quest to silence the flesh, they saved the mind. If you pause and listen to the chant of monks echoing through the cloister, you might feel a strange contradiction. It's serene, beautiful, haunting, and deeply human. The same faith that preached renunciation ended up creating some of the most sensual art and music in history. It's as if desire, denied expression through the body, slipped into melody instead. By the late Middle Ages, this monastic culture had transformed Europe's moral DNA. The idea that virtue meant self-control spread far beyond the cloisters to kings, merchants, even lovers. It shaped law, literature, and family life. The battlefield that began inside the heart had expanded into every corner of society. But the Church wasn't content to rule hearts through example alone. The next great innovation would allow it to peer inside those hearts to measure, catalog, and correct even invisible sins. That tool was confession, and with it, the church would learn the oldest form of power there, so knowing what people are too afraid to say aloud. Empires ruled by armies can fall overnight. Empires ruled by guilt last for centuries. By now, you've watched the Roman Empire collapse, monasteries rise, and morality tighten like armor. But in this new Europe, the real battlefield moves indoors, not to cathedrals or courts, but to confessionals, those small wooden boxes where souls whisper their secrets to men in robes. It's here, in the hush between sin and forgiveness, that the church perfects its quietest weapon control through conscience. You kneel on cold stone, the smell of incense heavy in the air. The priest's voice murmurs behind a lattice, calm but unyielding. Speak, my child. And you do. You confess what you've done, what you've thought, even what you've almost thought. It's a strange kind of freedom to speak without being seen, but also a strange kind of surveillance. For the first time in European history, private desire becomes public record. In the early centuries, confession wasn't personal, it was communal. Christians would stand before their congregation and admit their sins aloud. Imagine doing that at Sunday service today. No one would come back next week. So the church made it private, safer, more intimate. But with privacy came power. By the 12th century, confession was mandatory for all believers at least once a year. It was no longer just about repentance, it was about regulation. What's fascinating is how detailed those confessions became. Priests were trained to ask questions, lots of them. Manuals for confessors listed entire catalogs of possible sins, some more imaginative than others. They didn't just ask what you did. They asked how often, why, with whom, and what you thought while doing it. One could say the church invented the world's first psychological interview. Freud just arrived a millennium late, and in those whispered exchanges, Europe's view of morality crystallized. Lust, gluttony, pride. These weren't just acts anymore. They were habits to be monitored, measured, and corrected. The church became a moral physician, diagnosing sins of the soul the way doctors diagnosed fevers. But there was a cost. Every believer learned to fear their own thoughts. Guilt became a daily companion, following you even into dreams. St. Thomas Aquinas, that gentle genius of theology, tried to codify it all. In his Summa Theologica, he treated sin almost scientifically, dividing it into mortal and venial, external and internal. To him, desire itself wasn't evil. It just needed to be ordered toward the right purpose. But to ordinary ears, those fine distinctions blurred. People didn't hear nuance. They heard warning. Better to fear desire than risk misusing it. You can see the ripple effect everywhere. Artists painted saints with eyes raised heavenward, as if terrified to look at anything human. Writers filled morality plays with devils whispering in lovers' ears. Even jokes became suspect. Laughter was linked to vanity, vanity to pride, pride to damnation. Europe had learned to blush. And yet, confession also brought something remarkable: intimacy. For all its control, it offered connection. People who might never speak their feelings to a spouse would spill their hearts to a priest. It was, in its own way, emotional technology, a medieval therapy session wrapped in incense and Latin. Through confession, The church didn't just police desire, it humanized it. The sinner, once condemned, could now be healed. Still, power and compassion make uneasy neighbors. The same system that forgave sins could also weaponize them. Kings, queens, and peasants all confessed to the same authority. What they whispered in fear could later shape politics. Alliances, even wars. The church knew what everyone wanted, and in a world built on guilt, that knowledge was priceless. It's tempting to judge these centuries as repressive, but they were also deeply introspective. Europeans learned to think about motive, intention, and the hidden machinery of the heart. A Roman might have said, "I did it." A medieval Christian learned to ask, "Why did I want to?" That shift in self-awareness changed not just faith, but philosophy. It gave birth to conscience, and eventually to psychology. Of course, not everyone found peace in confession. Some grew tired of kneeling, tired of guilt that seemed to multiply faster than forgiveness. You can almost hear the grumbling of merchants, scholars, and peasants alike. If every thought is sin, then who isn't guilty? That question would smolder for centuries, until one monk finally shouted it loud enough to shatter the old order. But before that moment of rebellion, Europe would face its darkest test, yet a time when the church's obsession with purity turned into fear, and fear into fire. The same institution that taught forgiveness would begin to hunt the very desires it claimed to heal. The smell of smoke drifts across the fields, not from hearths or harvest fires, but from something darker stakes, piled high and crackling. You hear chants, not hymns, and realize that Europe's war on desire has spilled out of the soul and into the streets. What began as a whisper in confession now becomes an accusation in public squares. The church that once healed sinners now hunts them. Heresy and witchcraft, those are the new words for deviation. The lines blur between spiritual disobedience and moral disobedience. To crave, to question, to live differently, all could be proof of the devil's touch. You stand in the crowd as a preacher warns that temptation isn't just within you anymore, it walks among you, wearing human faces. The enemy of purity now has a body, often a woman's. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with fear. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe reeled from plagues, famine, and war. When fields failed and cities emptied, people needed someone to blame. The church, still the ultimate moral authority, offered an explanation. Both simple and terrifying evil had infiltrated the world through human sin. And if sin had a gender, well, centuries of sermons had already given the answer. Take the Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It claimed that women were more prone to witchcraft because they were weaker in faith and more carnal by nature. It wasn't fringe ideology, it became a bestseller, second only to the Bible. Every village that read it saw devils in its daughters. You can see how the theology of purity, once confined to monasteries, now spread like wildfire across Europe. The same moral codes that told monks to tame their desires now told townsfolk to tame their neighbors. Suspicion became civic duty. The old festivals of fertility, those last echoes of Rome, were replaced by witch trials. Bonfires, once celebratory, turned punitive. But witch hunts weren't only about superstition, they were about control. In a world where female sexuality had long been cast as dangerous, the witch embodied every forbidden aspect at once: independence, intelligence, sensuality, power. She was Eve and Lilith, and the serpent rolled into one. And burning her became an act of purification, a public exorcism of collective guilt. You might wonder, did anyone resist this madness? Some did. Humanists like Erasmus of Rotterdam mocked the hysteria. Where ignorance is worship, cruelty soon follows, he warned. A few priests, quietly skeptical, urged mercy. But for most, fear drowned out reason. It's hard to question the system when everyone believes the stakes literally are your salvation. Meanwhile, heresy became a broader net. It wasn't just witches. Anyone who challenged church authority, or even preached a gentler gospel, could find themselves condemned. The Cathars of southern France, who taught that the material world was corrupt, were slaughtered in crusades launched not against Muslims, but fellow Christians. Their real crime claiming purity without church permission. There's a tragic irony in all this. The church that began by preaching the sanctity of the body now burned it to protect the soul. Centuries of teaching that flesh was dangerous had prepared Europe to see pain as holy and suffering as justice. A woman screaming at the stake was no longer a human tragedy. It was, in their eyes, the sound of sin leaving the world. And yet, beneath that horror, something was changing. As fear reached its peak, doubt began to stir. Thinkers started asking dangerous questions. If all humans are born sinful, can any institution truly claim to be pure? If God is love, why does his church deal in fear? It's no coincidence that the Renaissance dawned just as the witch hunts reached their height. As the smoke rose, so did curiosity. You stand in Florence or Wittenberg and feel the air shift. Painters paint human bodies again, unapologetically. Scholars study ancient texts, rediscovering the idea that reason and beauty might not be enemies of faith. The pendulum, long pressed toward repression, begins to swing back. But it won't stop without breaking something. Soon, the church's monopoly on morality will shatter under the hammer of reform. Monks will marry, priests will protest, and whole nations will reject the confessional leash. But before we reach that rebellion, you have to understand what made it possible. The same guilt that once kept Europe obedient had, over time, made it introspective, and self-awareness, once awakened, can't be burned away. You wake to the sound of a lute, not a bell. Outside your window, spring sunlight spills across a courtyard where young nobles flirt under the gaze of stone saints. The Europe you see now isn't the one of fires and fear. It's the late Middle Ages, when love, against all odds, dares to become beautiful again after centuries of silence and suspicion. The heart begins to hum a different tune. Somewhere in Provence, a troubadour strums his song of devotion. He calls his lady my joy, my torment, my heaven on earth. The church might frown, but he doesn't care. For him, love is no longer sin, it's salvation. And in that daring thought, you can sense the quiet rebellion unfolding. Courtly love, they called it, though it had little to do with courts and everything to do with yearning. It took the language of theology and turned it toward desire. A man pledged himself to a woman the way a monk pledged himself to God through service, patience, and worship. It sounds romantic, and it was, but it was also revolutionary. Europe had been told for centuries that desire led to ruin. Now, poets began to suggest that it could lead to grace. Their verses echoed through castles, carried by memory more than ink. He who loves, lives nobly, wrote Chrétien de Troyes, the father of Arthurian romance. And just like that, love slipped through the cracks of doctrine and made itself sacred again. Meanwhile, mystics within the church began writing about divine love in ways that sounded startlingly human. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux described his soul's union with God, using the imagery of kisses and embraces. Saint Teresa of Avila would later write of the sweetness of his touch upon my heart. If you read her today, you might blush. But in her time, it was ecstasy sanctified a bridge between flesh and faith that no inquisition could burn. You might say, Europe rediscovered its body, but in a new form, metaphorical, poetic, yearning but restrained. Painters began to study anatomy, not to glorify sin, but to capture divine beauty in human form. The naked figures of Adam and Eve on cathedral doors no longer looked ashamed. They looked alive. Even the Virgin Mary softened. In the Renaissance that followed, she smiled again. Of course, not everyone applauded this awakening. The church walked a tightrope, torn between condemning and co-opting love's revival. Priests preached against vain songs of lust, yet secretly commissioned love poetry for their own circles. Marriage sermons grew warmer, more forgiving. The idea that affection between spouses might be holy, even pleasurable, began to creep into sermons. What had once been tolerated under grim duty now found a hint of joy. But the deepest change wasn't in doctrine, it was in emotion. For the first time since Rome, Europeans began to believe that love could make you better, not worse. A knight who adored a lady learned patience, humility, service. A mystic who loved God learned compassion, desire, properly channeled, became a teacher instead of a trap. The same flame that once burned heretics now lit candles for lovers. You can feel that shift ripple through daily life. Letters replace confessions. Poetry replaces penance. Lovers begin to write, I burn for you, and no one calls the fire unholy, even in monasteries. Hymns to divine love adopt the rhythms of romantic verse. It's as if Europe's collective heart, long pressed under the stone weight of guilt, had begun to beat again. Still, this rebirth isn't without tension. Every song of devotion balances on the edge of blasphemy. When Dante writes of Beatrice guiding him to heaven, readers sense he means more than metaphor. When painters depict angels with sensuous grace, bishops mutter uneasily, the old anxiety hasn't died, it's merely evolved. The church can no longer suppress desire, so it baptizes it. And perhaps that's the most fascinating paradox of all. The same faith that once feared the body now sponsors art that glorifies it. Michelangelo's David, carved centuries later, will stand as proof a body made perfect, not in rebellion against God, but as his reflection. The troubadours, the mystics, the poets, they don't overthrow Christianity. They humanize it. They remind Europe that holiness without humanity is hollow. The doctrine of fear begins to give way to the theology of love. In cathedrals, stained glass tells stories not just of saints dying, but of mothers weeping, lovers parting, families embracing. Compassion enters where condemnation once ruled. And so, from the ashes of heresy and the songs of lovers, a new moral rhythm emerges, one where the heart and the soul, long estranged, finally remember that they belong to the same body. But this reconciliation, as tender as it seems, will leave a lasting question that echoes all the way to the modern world if love can be holy. What then is left of sin? Civilizations fall when their armies fail. But moral empires linger long after their churches grow silent. You stand in modern Europe, centuries away from the Roman baths and the medieval cloisters. Yet the echoes are unmistakable. Every debate about morality, every argument over freedom, every whisper of guilt after pleasure, all of it traces back to that ancient collision between flesh and faith. Early Christianity didn't just change how people prayed. It rewired how an entire civilization thought about the body. Walk through a museum in Paris or Rome, and you can still feel it. The sculptures of saints look suspiciously like Greek gods who've been told to behave. Even modern fashion, the instinct to cover, reveal, and judge carries the same ancient push and pull between virtue and vanity. When a culture teaches for 1,000 years that desire must be controlled, the habit doesn't vanish. It just changes costume. You can see this legacy in the simplest things. A wedding ring, a confessional, a word like purity. They're remnants of a long theological experiment in regulating the human heart. Rome conquered with legions. Christianity conquered with guilt. And guilt, it turns out, doesn't retire easily. Even in today's secular Europe, it hides in plain sight in laws, in etiquette, in the subtle blush that comes when passion meets propriety. Think of how language itself bears the mark. The English word sin comes from the Old English sin, meaning to miss the mark. But who decided what the mark was for centuries? The Church did. And in doing so, it created an invisible architecture of morality that still holds shape even when faith fades. The sexual revolution of the 20th century wasn't a rebellion against nature. It was a rebellion against 1,500 years of inherited caution. You might smile at how far things have come. The Europe that once burned witches now celebrates pride parades. Monks who swore celibacy would hardly recognize the continent that legalizes same-sex marriage and sells perfume called temptation. Yet even here, in the glow of liberation, the old ghosts linger. Modern culture still debates pleasure as if it's a problem to solve too much, too little, too public, too private. The vocabulary changes. The moral anxiety remains. Take the idea of confession. The booth is gone, but the instinct survives. People confess now online, in comment threads, in therapy rooms, on talk shows. The audience has changed. The ritual hasn't. We still crave absolution, still believe that sharing our shame can somehow wash it away. St. Augustine would have understood the appeal of a viral apology video perfectly. Even modern relationships echo the old struggle between duty and desire. The ideal of romantic love that two souls find redemption in each other owes more to Christian marriage than to any pagan myth. And the guilt that follows betrayal, even in a secular heart, feels suspiciously theological. Europe no longer kneels before the altar, but it still measures love against invisible commandments. Of course, not all legacies are heavy. Christianity's reshaping of sexual morality also gave birth to the idea of conscience, equality before God, and the notion that even the powerful are bound by moral law. The same system that bred guilt also birthed compassion. Monks who condemned lust also cared for the sick. Priests who feared sin also defended the poor. Out of suspicion grew empathy, the recognition that all humans wrestle with the same hidden fire. You can see that compassion in art, in law, in how Europe still treats human dignity as sacred, even when it no longer speaks the language of faith. The continent's moral DNA may have started in fear, but it evolved toward care. The idea that every person, regardless of birth, gender, or desire, has inherent worth, ironically. That too is Christian. Still, the paradox remains. You live in a world that celebrates pleasure yet inherits shame, that preaches freedom yet whispers caution. It's a tug of war that began the moment Christianity looked at the Roman world's open indulgence and said, "No, there is something higher, something holier." The centuries since have been Europe's long attempt to balance those two truths, that the body is beautiful and that the soul is more than flesh. So, when you look around at the art that trembles between holiness and hunger, at the laws that still draw lines between desire and decency, you're seeing the afterglow of that ancient moral revolution. Early Christianity didn't just conquer Rome, it conquered the imagination. It taught Europe to live with contradiction, to touch but tremble, to love but fear, to sin and then seek forgiveness. And maybe that's why the story still feels alive. Because whether you're a monk in a stone cell or a stranger scrolling through your phone at midnight, the question hasn't really changed. Can you embrace what makes you human without losing what makes you holy? The Romans answered with pleasure. The Christians answered with penance. Modernity, somehow, is still deciding. The firelight dims and history exhales. You've journeyed through temples and cathedrals, through laughter, guilt, and prayer, watching Europe learn to balance the body and the soul. The Romans danced for their gods. The Christians knelt for theirs, and from that long struggle was born the world you know tonight. Let the weight of centuries loosen from your mind. The whispers of saints and the songs of lovers grow quiet together. Breathe slowly. The past no longer judges you. It only hums a lullaby of faith and flesh. Sleep, and let the ages drift away.